Tonight, I'm really delighted to introduce a speaker I've actually known for many years. We were just trying to figure out how long it is since we last crossed paths, but John and I both have worked in television, and John has had an extremely distinguished career. He started out at Yorkshire TV, I believe, is that correct? And was responsible for many outstanding documentaries, including Johnny Go Home, which some of you may remember from a long time ago. He's also been controller of factual programs at Channel 4, where he set up a number of different documentary strands, including Cutting Edge and True Stories and Secret History, particular favourite of mine. He later became director of programs at Channel 4. He's been a chairman of BAFTA, and I could go on, but he's had many. Basically, he's a big cheese in TV, this guy. But in recent years, John has turned his hand to military history and written a number of books, including a couple of very interesting books about the Battle of Britain. John may want to, if we have time at the end, he may be able to talk about one or two of them. And his most recent book is the reason we're here tonight, is Nagasaki, The Forgotten Prisoner's Story. Now, many of you here may be better informed than me, but I really didn't know about the stories of the British and Allied and Dominion prisoners of war who ended up in POW camps close to Nagasaki and were there when the second atomic bomb was detonated. And their stories are pretty incredible, not just for having been there at Nagasaki, but the stories of their experiences beforehand and what took them there, stories of incredible difficulty, cruelty, courage, bravery, endurance. I mean, mind-blowing, to be honest. And, you know, I think the fact that they ended up, after all the terrible things they went through, they ended up in the precincts of the second atomic bomb, and just, you must wonder what, when your luck's out, your luck's out. So I will hand over to John. I know he's got a few copies of his book that he's happy to sign at the end. So please feel free to come and approach John at the end of the talk. We will have time for some questions and answers as well at the end. So without further ado, I shall hand over to John Willis.
You're so tall, Joe, I have to lower the mic. Thank you very much, Joe, for that really embarrassing introduction, but it's lovely to be here in Bath, and thank you very much for giving up your evening to hear me talk about Nagasaki, the Forgotten Prisoners. The first question I always get asked is, why did I write the book? And I wrote it because these men are absolutely unique. They're the only non-Japanese eyewitnesses to one of the most disturbing, one of the most powerful, one of the most earth-shattering events of history. And they were on the ground. They're the only people who really know what it's like to be there when an atomic weapon is let off. And of course, the nuclear saber rattling by Putin over Ukraine has only made this more topical. It's really important that we understand. Okay. And why forgotten? Well, when they came back from the camps, not just the...
It's okay, this is obscuring you a little bit for the online people. So I'm just going to, perhaps if you go slightly to your left.
Okay. You can tell he worked in TV once. He wasn't much of a director, but he was a...
Yeah. My setup's not so good tonight. So, there you go. So, John, so why don't you stand in now?
Okay.
And then see.
Here's
that's it. That'll do it.
Okay.
That's it. Apologies, everyone.
No. Thank you. Take two. On why forgotten? Well, when these men came back, not just from Nagasaki, but from all the prisoners of war camps controlled by the Japanese, they were thin, skeletal, hungry. But the world had changed because VJ Day, the war in Japan, finished several months after VE Day in Europe. And people were getting the threads of their lives back together again. They were having children, getting married, getting jobs. They were settling down. And suddenly these men came back off the ships in a British winter emaciated, then unrecognizable, even to their families, some of them. And it was awkward and embarrassing. So they felt forgotten, and many have done ever since. But they also felt forgotten at the time because people didn't know, their families weren't always aware whether they were dead or alive. The number of the communications were an odd few lines on a postcard, perhaps every year or every couple of years, if they were lucky. Some didn't even have that. And post was often hoarded by the Japanese. So it was really difficult for people back in the UK to know whether their loved ones were alive or not. And so, of course, they also felt forgotten because of that. But of course, this is also a story, as Joe said, of extraordinary courage, of absolutely amazing endurance. It's impossible to imagine that you get pushed to the very extremes of human endurance and survive. And this is what these men did. It's an extraordinary story. There was malnutrition, disease, brutality. But this is a story in a curious way of hope and of resilience, because some of the men come through it. And I just sort of thought I'd start by just introducing you to the three men on the front cover and their stories of survival. On the left, nearest to me, is Clyde Shelton, who's an American. And he was a member of what they call the Lost Battalion, which was a battalion of American soldiers from Texas and Oklahoma who just disappeared in Java when they were picked up by the Japanese, and lots of the families had no idea what had happened to their sons. And Clyde didn't join the forces because he was patriotic. He was hungry. He'd lived through the Depression. He had a large family, and it was a way of putting food on the table. And he said that living through the Great Depression in America was a good rehearsal for living in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. On the right-hand side, Alan Chick, who is an Australian, you can tell from the elegant hat. He survived the bomb, and after the war, married a Japanese woman. He went back as one of the occupying forces. You'd think you'd never want to go back, but he did. And he lived, despite the atomic bomb being dropped a mile away from where he was standing, he lived till the age of 93. In the middle, Aidan McCarthy, who was in the Royal Air Force. He was a doctor from Ireland, from County Cork. He was a remarkable character, and he survived by a mixture of skill, strength, and I think probably being doctors, you were not at the front end of some of the heavy work, but he did some amazing things, operations just with a razor blade, taking someone's appendix out, because it was all barbed wire surgery without much in the way of medicine at all. And then the sort of hero, in a way, of my book, on the nearest to me with the big ears, that's Ron Breyer. And this is an amazing man, because I don't think I've ever met anyone who was more hardwired to survive than Ron. He was one of 10 children from a small village outside Harrogate in North Yorkshire, and he learned to poach and steal and grab the food off the table in front of his brothers and sisters. But he was also highly intelligent, and he decided in his own way that he was never going to be beaten by the Japanese. He was going to take them on. He was going to steal from them, not from his fellow prisoners, but he was going to do everything to survive. He was going to stand up to them, and he was not going to be beaten, and he wasn't. This is, let me just go back to perhaps to the cover. This is an oral history. It's in the words of the men who survived the horrors that I've just described. But I think it's important to know some context. And there were two powerful interconnected currents flowing through Japan in the run-up to the Second World War. The first was a profound sense of Japanese destiny. They felt they were a nation of great warriors. They felt they were a nation of destiny, and that one of their destinies was to lead all of Asia. And throughout the 1930s, right-wing military leaders increasingly controlled Japanese politics, had a very loud voice. More and more money was diverted into armaments, and increasingly in the education system, not just the military education system, but as we got closer to the war, in the general education system, the ideals of the military were being hard-baked in. Secondly, the other undercurrent was that Japan was very short of raw materials to fuel both its military ambition and its domestic industry. 80% of its oil was imported from the USA. And when Japan started a war with China, the USA and the UK embargoed sales. So Japan looked enviously at the iron ore, the rubber, and the oil in the Dutch East Indies and in the British Empire in the Far East. And of course, at that time, the eyes of the Allies were firmly on Europe. But things changed when Japan attacked the American battleship fleet at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941. And in that moment, Japan removed a major obstacle, or the major obstacle, to grabbing all the raw materials it needed. On the same day that Japan smashed Pearl Harbor, they invaded Malaysia, rubber-rich Malaysia or Malaya, and they swept swiftly south. They were good fighters, well-trained, battle-hardened in other conflicts, very well equipped. The Allies didn't have a single tank in Malaya, not one tank, and the Japanese, although they had smaller numbers of men, were much more formidable fighting force, and they soon took control of the skies and eventually of the oceans when they sank two of the British capital battleships, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse. Eventually, they reached Singapore, Fortress Singapore, as it was called. This was the great defensive shield that was going to protect the whole region from the Japanese, but it didn't. So I'd just like to read one or two little excerpts of what people wrote about surrender and the fall of Singapore. This is Private Bert Miller from Diss in Norfolk. The air was full of choking dust, and during the showers, the clouds wept black tears as the rain passed through the oil-laden smoke. There was no escape from the stench of cordite, sewers, and rotting flesh. We'd been blasted into another world, and it was a silence that screamed at us. Some wept, some cursed, and those too exhausted to curse and unable to fight any longer fell where they stood and fitfully slept. Then we waited. We could feel certain only of the past. The present offered nothing but bewilderment and contradiction. Ron Breyer, who from Harrogate in Yorkshire, who I mentioned, escaped Singapore to Java, but he was soon captured there after a long trek through the jungle. And I just describe his moment of capture. The Japanese officer, they marched through the jungle. Suddenly they met a battalion of Japanese, highly armed. The Japanese officer raised his revolver and pointed the barrel straight at Ron's eyes. And the soldier asked if Ron had a gun. Fortunately, he'd been told a few minutes before, throw all the guns in the bushes, which is what they'd done. So this is what happened next. Down the yawning black tunnel, big enough to crawl into, I seemed to see the shining nose of a bullet waiting to smash into a brain that no longer cared or was afraid. Every small part of me ached with hunger and exhaustion. I lifted my eyes from the gun barrel and looked directly into the almond-shaped eyes below the peaked cap. Expressionless eyes, hard and brittle as marbles, in a dead white face. We both knew that at that moment, my life lay in the crook of his forefinger. Well, the fact that Ron survived meant that he lowered the gun. So thousands of Allied prisoners in Singapore and those who were shipped over from Java or Sumatra were housed in the British barracks in Singapore, the former British barracks, Changi, which is quite a famous or infamous name. And although to begin with, they had a few tins of corned beef. Eventually, malnutrition and disease set in because the diet was very basic. It was low-grade rice and not much else, perhaps a bit of watery soup. And faced with the diet of very poor rice, thousands of prisoners learned to catch and eat anything that moved. Frank Fujita was the only Japanese American in the Far East combat, only one. He was a member of the Lost Battalion, as was Clyde Shelton, the 131st Field Artillery Regiment from Texas, and he'd been captured on Java. He described the natural cycle of life. The open trench latrines were full of flies laying eggs. Excuse me, I can't do an American accent. When they hatched, the maggots would swarm out in all directions from the pit. They were white and made the ground surrounding the pit look as if it was covered with snow. Sparrows would come down and feed on the maggots. The Americans fashioned homemade catapults from old inner tubes and shot the sparrows before cooking them in a tin helmet. Sparrows fried up in red palm oil until they're crisp were really good eating. We would eat the sparrows, then turn past them back into the trench to begin the whole process again. Fujita called this the theory of perpetual motion. After the abject surrender in Singapore and Java, thousands of Allied prisoners were shipped out to build the Thai-Burma railway, including the famous bridge on the River Kwai. One unit tramped through the jungle for nearly 200 miles to reach their remote work huts. The monsoon season opened shortly after midnight with a storm of operatic extravagance. Bolts of lightning illuminated the jungle like magnesium flares. Shafts of rain lashed our fragile shelter. The shafts turned into sheets of water, and the lean-to collapsed on top of us. We waited for dawn, huddled and shivering at the foot of a tree. The rainforest closed in, dank and opaque, and we slipped into a leaden lethargy. I slunk away, hid, and when the last column was out of sight, laid myself down on a bed of ferns, waiting for death. Lying on my back with my eyes closed, I felt a presence. It was a Thai balancing a bunch of bananas on his head. I opened my pack, offered him a pair of khaki shorts, and mine putting food into my mouth. I devoured the whole bunch, a dozen or more bananas. I stood up, and a tremendous fart exploded, breaking the stillness of the forest. The gut untwisted, and I felt life flowing again. The prisoners from Changi were a totally available and totally dispensable force of free forced labor for the Japanese. The railway was 258 miles long, including 10 miles of bridges through thick jungle terrain. It was built almost entirely by hand and at record speed. And halfway through the process, the Japanese decided they wanted the railway quicker, and they pushed harder and harder. The working conditions were almost unbearable, hacking away at rock in the full gaze of the midday sun, or digging up the thick red mud in teeming rain, barefooted, with feet bleeding from the broken rock or sharp bamboo thorns, hatless and naked, except for a brief loincloth. And all the time, the blasted bloody nips screaming and shouting, bellowing and beating, bashing, forcing and bullying us to work faster, faster, faster. In the eyes of the Japanese, the lives of the prisoners held no value. They didn't deserve to live, so it didn't really matter if they died. Although you would think it was in the best interests of the Japanese to provide enough food and medicine to keep their primary workforce fit enough to build a railway. But medicine was held back, and without drugs and equipment, the doctors practiced a very rudimentary kind of jungle medicine. They were the thin line against disease and malnutrition, including lethal tropical ulcers. One prisoner was sawing bamboo to repair a hut. The doctor took the handsaw from me and dipped it into boiling water for a while. Several orderlies held a man down by his head, arms, and body as the doctor cut off his leg just below the knee. He returned the saw to the bucket, gave it to me, and I returned to cutting bamboo. I don't know whether any anesthetic was used, but to my knowledge, we had none. The doctors did marvelous things with practically nothing up there in that hellhole. There were about 12,000 prisoners died in a year building the railway, a death rate of around 20%, although in one camp, a British camp a long way up the line, the death rate was just over 60%. They thought that working on the railway in such primitive conditions, fighting off malnutrition, disease, including cholera, and being hungry all the time, was the absolute bottom, was the nadir of their existence, living more like animals than humans. But Japan was so short of manpower, having built the railway, so short of manpower to drive its industry at home, because all the fit men were off fighting or had been killed in the fighting, that they were transported to the mainland in what became known as hell ships. One hell ship lost 1,159 men to a US torpedo. Only 159 survived. So they were in this extraordinary situation where they were crammed into the holds, thousands of men of what were called hell ships, were rusty old craters, really, and they were being torpedoed by their own side, which was extraordinary. And one of the debates among historians is how much did the Allies know? And there are fairly recently intercepts have come, coded intercepts have come, which suggest that they did have an idea that some of these convoys carried Allied soldiers. One ship that was torpedoed, a British gunner, Alfred Albury, was 6 days in the water, surviving. He survived 6 days. And this is his description of what happened. The raft slid up and down steep-sided waves. It had been my home for nearly a week now. I could see nothing, and tiny speck that I was upon the endless water, I knew nothing could see me. He drifted in and out of consciousness, and 1 minute he imagined being back at home in London planting beans with his wife, and the next he dreamt of his brutal experiences building the Thai-Burma railway. I woke from the dream and I knew it wouldn't be very long now. That was the end. I felt nothing, no emotion. I was past feeling anything at all. Mine, I knew, was the calmness from which I could slip into unconsciousness and death. Then an American submarine, the Barb, on a rescue mission, spotted a tiny speck, a body splayed out in a wooden raft. Alfred Albury was the last of the 14 survivors they rescued. The captain wrote in his patrol report, "The expression on their faces is something that's hard to describe. They were so thankful for being picked up. Most of them couldn't talk. They would just cry. Even in their condition, they had few tears left. In their glazed, oil-soaked eyes, you could see expressions of gratitude." And there's no stranger story than that of the submarine USS Pampanito. In September 1944, she smashed a torpedo into a hell ship. 500 prisoners of war died. And a few days afterwards, the Pampanito was back in the area looking for more prey. They saw strange figures waving at them from a raft bobbing in the sea. And so they shouted, "Get the one who speaks English." An Australian voice angrily shouted back, "You bloody bastards, we all speak English." The submariners were astonished. They had torpedoed 500 men from their own side to their deaths and were now to rescue 73 of the starving survivors. Those survivors not rescued by the Americans were transported onto Nagasaki, where prisoners were housed in 2 camps in the city. Life in Nagasaki was hard, but probably better than it was on the railway. They worked long, hard days in the shipyards and the foundries of the city. Food was again low-grade rice and watery soup. Medical supplies were hoarded by the Japanese. There was no cholera, but pneumonia without any hope of medical treatment was lethal. And they would work in furnaces and foundries and then go out into the cold Nagasaki winter. And more than 100 men in these camps died mainly of pneumonia. Thousands of women and children, Japanese women and children, were also seconded by the Japanese into the war effort. They were free and they were slightly better fed, but their working lives were probably just as miserable as the Australians, the Dutch, and the British working in the foundries in Nagasaki. One Australian noted or saw A woman carrying scrap in the foundry collapsed and in 30 minutes gave birth to a child. The guard cut the cord with his bayonet and the baby was washed in cold water, wrapped and put into a basket near the furnace. 2 hours after the birth, the woman was forced to commence work again. This nearly caused a riot with the Australians. There were 2 camps in Nagasaki, 14B, which was, as it happened, just the police have come for me, which happened just a mile from the epicenter where the bomb was detonated, and Camp 2B, which was a little bit further away and probably 4 or 5 kilometers away, and that was the larger camp. But that was a particularly brutal place to be imprisoned. Frank Fujita, who I mentioned before, the one who ate sparrows of the Lost Battalion of Texas, was particularly scared because not only was he a Japanese American, but actually his father had been born in Nagasaki, and he knew that when the Japanese found out this, that he would be punished, and he was. Wham, wham, wham. Oh, how that did hurt. I didn't know that pain could attain such a high degree of intensity. My entire head seemed to explode. My senses spun round and seemed to pulsate in and out, bordering on unconsciousness. And then came the full frontal attack. This time, the guard kicked me in my chest with his heavy army shoes, and at the same time, his shin crashed into my already battered face. Blood was gushing out of my face at all points, but I was still standing, proud and erect, or at least I thought I was. 3 days after Hiroshima, on August the 9th, 1945, the most powerful bomb ever unleashed was dropped on Nagasaki. It was flown by Chuck Sweeney, age 25, from Massachusetts. And almost everything that went wrong on a mission happened on this occasion. The pump to the supplementary fuel tank failed. One of the observer planes missed a rendezvous close to Japan. The official photographer forgot his parachute and was thrown off the plane. I mean, not thrown off before it took off. The target wasn't even Nagasaki, but Kokura, where the Japanese military arsenal was based. But Kokura was shrouded in cloud that day and smoke, and dropping the bomb accurately was impossible. So they flew onto the secondary target, Nagasaki. And in that moment, Kokura lived and Nagasaki was condemned to death. Yorkshireman Ron Breyer was mending a small bomb shelter in Camp 14B. There was a tremendous violet, white, blue flash, almost liquid in intensity. Not a momentary thing, it seemed to last for several seconds right outside the hole above my head. There was tremendous vibration along with it, not an explosion at all. And then, as the vibrations continued, the wall of the shelter came down. When I came to, the world was black with no identifying features. I thought I was dead. Frank Fujita. This is the hell ships. Sorry, I should. That's Chuck Sweeney. That's the plane. And that's the explosion. New York Times writer William Lawrence was flying in an observer aircraft and described the image 45 seconds after the detonation. It was no longer smoke or dust or even a cloud of fire. It was a living thing, a new species born right before our incredulous eyes. At one stage in its evolution, covering millions of years in terms of seconds, the entity assumed the identity of a giant square totem pole with its base about 3 miles long. Its bottom was brown, its center amber, its top white. But it was a living totem pole, carved with many grotesque masks grimacing at the earth. There came shooting out of the top a mushroom that increased the height of the pillar to a total of 45,000 feet. The mushroom top was even more alive than the pillar, seething and boiling in a white fury of creamy foam. The whole of Camp 14B, where Ron Breyer was wiped out. And when he came to, he saw Japanese workmen running wildly through a haze. There were possibly 100 in number, leaping and scrambling with desperation over the fallen fences and rubble. None looked either left or right as they passed me on both sides. I heard no sound except the noise of their panting, the desperate noise of animals cornered after the hunt. Deep sobbing gasps of despair from lungs tortured by the demands of a flight from death. Many wore clothing still on fire. It smoldered and sparked as they ran. But others cared not. Others, almost naked, bore huge blisters as big as party balloons on arms and legs, and torn remnants of scorched cloth burned into other body areas exposed to the blast. Blisters collapsed as I watched, and streamers of ragged skin fluttered like wind-torn pennants as the men fled in terror towards the imagined safety of the open countryside. An Australian close to the epicenter had a similar view of the Japanese running by. Hundreds had all their skin burnt off their bodies. Hundreds more had blackened skin hanging from them in strips. Others had blisters under the blackened skin. The liquid in the blisters could be measured in pints. I could see it sloshing as they walked. One journalist, George Weller from the Chicago Daily News, eventually smuggled himself into Nagasaki because there was a news lockdown. The military authorities, the Americans in particular, didn't want anyone to know what had happened. And this is what he wrote. Dropping the atomic bomb on Nagasaki after Hiroshima's bomb was like hitting Pittsburgh after Detroit. The puff of death quickly scurried up the valleys of hilly Nagasaki. I saw a city frizzled like a baked apple, crusted black at the open core when the searing sun born in the New Mexico desert has split open the blue sky of midday. I saw the long, crumpled skeleton of the Mitsubishi electrical motor and ship fitting plant, a framework blasted clean of its flesh by the lazy falling missile floating under a parachute. His reports were never published and they were banned by the military censor. They only surfaced in 2003 when carbon copies were discovered. Documentary footage of the victims of the bomb was buried by the American authorities for 37 years. It was a miracle that in the closest camp to the detonation point, 14B, only 8 prisoners were killed and about 30 were injured, because within a mile of the detonation point, everyone died, and they were 1.1 miles away. And according to the official reports by the Japanese and by the Americans, there are many deaths reported up to 2.5 miles away. They were lucky. They were unlucky to be in Nagasaki, but lucky because while the local Japanese were living in wooden buildings or out in the open air going about their daily business, some of them were in shelters and others were in concrete buildings in the barracks. And that seems to have made a huge amount of difference because the survival rate is pretty astonishing. Then a week after the bombing, the Americans began food drops. See if they've got those are the faces of the people in the camp. And this is liberation. So the Americans, you can see by food being dropped from the skies would be quite important. So they started dropping oil drums of chocolate and cake, butter and bacon, but it was dangerous. Ron Breyer, who I mentioned earlier on, was almost killed when a pallet of chewing gum dropped from above missed him by inches. He noted wryly, having survived the atom bomb, I don't think it was written that I should be killed by a ton of American chewing gum. So on 12th of September 1945, a month after the bomb was dropped, the Americans began evacuating prisoners through the port of Nagasaki. Overall, the death rate of Allied prisoners in Japanese hands was around about 30%, 1 in 3. The pity, as I described at the beginning, when I explained why I thought they felt forgotten, the pitifully thin skeletons who survived the Japanese camps now had to reintegrate into a world that had changed dramatically during their 4 years of imprisonment. Ken Adams, medical orderly, wrote, I was a human being again. I wasn't an animal wearing rags. Wearing decent clothes gave me a huge psychological lift. Using a knife and fork was the single most thrilling and important trapping of civilization for me. And Gus Ancorn described coming home to his fiancée, Lucille. Just touching hands was the most incredible experience you could imagine. I'd only known harsh, sun-parched, callous skin for so long now, and suddenly the wholesomeness and softness of Lucille was like an electric shock, awakening me. And finally, Lionel Morris returning home. My heart beat like a hammer. I rang the bell a third time. A window opened above my head, and my father's voice inquired, "Who is it?" I answered, "It's Lionel." He somewhat bewildered asked, "Lionel who?" "It's Lionel, your son. Who else should it be?" He came down the stairs 2 at a time. The door flung open, and he stood, gaping, unbelieving. I thought he was going to fall, but at last he got the message. "I'm all right," I said. "I've come home." And for perhaps just want to read just one other. People also ask, what was your memorable experience of writing this? Well, it was all memorable in lots of ways, but I was very privileged to meet one of the survivors of working on the River Kwai, aged 101. He's called Len Gibson, lived up in Sunderland, and I went to interview him because there were so few survivors left, and he started talking about the food and talking about something called jippo, which is basically the water with a little bit of maybe vegetable in it that he called, that was called jippo, which is what they survived on. And suddenly he picked up his guitar as if he was just around a campfire on the River Kwai and started to sing. It was an extraordinary moment. I just wanted to read what his little ditty was, because he wrote it himself. For dinner, there's rice, tea, and jippo. For supper, there's rice, jippo, and tea. Now, unless a miracle happens, I know what my breakfast will be. Last night, as I lay on my pillow, I dreamt of a gooseberry tart, to follow roast sirloin and Yorkshire, but I woke up before I could start. And for me, the success of the book isn't measured by sales, and there's a few you could buy, but isn't measured by sales or reviews, but it's how men like Len and their children felt about what I'd written and how they responded. And one son of a Nagasaki survivor wrote to me, "I couldn't put it down. It gives me a totally new understanding of my dad. Your work is outstanding. You've recorded history that will survive into perpetuity." And I was really touched by that note. And for me, the most important thing was that I didn't let the prisoners who'd endured so much down when I wrote the book. Thank you. As I said, there are a few books here, and I'm very happy to. The retail price is £25, which I think is a bit steep. So £20, and I'm very happy to sign any copies if anyone wants them. Otherwise, I'll take them all home and give them to Oxfam. So thank you.
And before we do that, I think we'll take some questions. So anyone who has a question, please raise your hand. Okay, you, sir. Bring the microphone back to you. Can I ask you, when asking your question, for the benefit of our online attendees, of whom there are many, can you hold it close to your lips?
Thank you. My name is David Burgess. Sorry, I've got a cough all of a sudden. I'm a naval historian, a naval researcher, living in Gosport. I've come up from Gosport to hear your lecture.
Oh gosh, okay.
But I was very privileged while I was doing my naval research, and my main area of research is around the Battle of the Java Sea, the loss of the Aberdeen fleet, which is totally unknown to 99% of the British public. We never talk about our defeats. We remember the victories. But over the years, I interviewed many of the sailors who were sunk in the battle, taken to Makassar, prisoner of war camps, and then where HMS Exeter, HMS Encounter in particular, the officers were separated along with anybody who had any engineering experience. They were the hellhole of Nagasaki camp, and I've got so many books on this. Taken to Java, Jakarta for a few days, where they were put, this is now in October 1942, and put on a hell ship to, as you explained. And in particular, a man who I befriended as a family friend for a long time, Andy Anderson, a chief engineer, a chief engine room artificer, taken to Nagasaki in November. He reached there in November 42, worked in 2 of the shipyards that you mentioned in Nagasaki for 2.5 years, and then transported to a coal mine in Nagasaki, where he spent the time repairing the coal mines, putting all the struts in the tunnels and everything. And he worked down there with Japanese civilians. It wasn't just prisoners of war. And he befriended quite a few of them. A lot of them were Christian, and that's why they were probably put to work in the camps. But everything you described at the beginning and later on, or what happened, he's down in the mine and the bomb is dropped on Nagasaki. No one in the mine knew. They came out at the end of the day, expecting then to be marched back to the camp. It was camp number 2, called Fukuoka 2. And they were surprised there was nobody there. For the first time in 2 3/4 years, no soldiers were there to march them back to the camp where they were under the brutal whip and everything. So they walked themselves. They got to their camp, and they found only about 3/4 of a mile away. They found nobody there, no guards there. But the camp commandant was there, and he shot himself in front of them because of, and then people began to say that something has happened here, something has happened. They were aware of something in Hiroshima because 3 days earlier, the Japanese guards had been running around using the word firebomb and things like that. So Andy and his friends, and one of them was that Irish doctor that you mentioned, began to walk towards Nagasaki. And they came over a hill. I've got his testament here written in 1952 in ink. I've got the wrong glasses on, and it was all typed up in the 60s. Yes, okay. And he described the Japanese people coming with those huge blisters and skin all hanging down. Andy he forgave the Japanese. He learned to live with them, and he tried to go back many years later.
Well, that's very true. There were, I think, at least 80 survivors of the sinking of the HMS Exeter in Camp 2B. And they were lucky to a certain extent that quite a lot of people moved out to work, as you say, at a coal mine, and weren't actually in Nagasaki when the bomb dropped. And there was still in that particular camp 450, but it had been a very large camp.
Okay, I'm going to take a question from the online chat now, from Debbie Lawley. Although there were survivors from the bomb, did they then suffer from radiation sickness? Now, I'm not sure whether she's referring to the POW survivors or the Japanese. But...
Well, I think in terms of the POW survivors, the answer is that no one really knows. There's been very little, if worked on it. There was one study at the University of Melbourne in the 1970s, which was on quite a small scale, and they found chromosome abnormalities, if that's the right phrase, in 3 out of 17 survivors, but 3 had already died of cancer. So they were very cautious in what they said, and I think that the answer is that there's never been an authoritative, significant, wide-ranging study, so no one will really know. But the evidence from the Japanese civilians is that radiation-related illnesses, obviously particularly cancer, do go on for a very long time afterwards.
Any more questions in the room? You don't want to be outdone by the online people. Okay, well, yeah, Peter.
Thanks, John. Great presentation. Is there any survivors left?
There's no survivors of Nagasaki left. Alan, who I mentioned, Alan Chick, got to 93. There's a few left from Japanese camps, even from working on the Thai-Burma Railroad. I interviewed the last survivor who actually built the bridge on the River Kwai. He died at 103 earlier this year. He was an absolutely remarkable, lovely man from Suffolk with a sort of Suffolk burr, and you couldn't quite square his experiences with his gentleness as a person. But his daughter said to me, he's as tough as old nails underneath it all, and that's how he that's how he survived. So there are a few left, but some are in care homes. There's not many who would be capable of expressing what they found.
Okay, so a question online from Dick Bateman. Dick says, "Thank you for that insightful talk. My auntie Frances was a nursing officer in the Andaman Islands, looking after British soldiers recuperating from the Burma Railway. She never forgave Japanese soldiers. What emotions, if any, did your interviewees feel towards their old enemies so long after the war?" And I know, John, you touch on this in the book. But
it's some. I think it's quite interesting. Some people will, because after all, some very well-known household names. Mitsubishi was basically Nagasaki's were company town. They were making aircraft, torpedoes, and warships, and not all in Nagasaki, but they were right at. So and they did eventually pay a sort of fairly pitiful amount of compensation. There's quite a lot of ill feeling against them. I think that most people I've talked to forgive the ordinary Japanese. They see it as an aberration. They see that this is what the political military leadership wanted, because as you said before, that there were acts of kindness, and I tried to make sure really carefully in the book when there were acts of kindness that they're mentioned, because of course not all guards were terrible. Some were scared of breaking ranks, but there were quite a lot of moments of kindness and sympathy and understanding, and quite a lot of particularly from Nagasaki, quite a lot of them have gone back, or did go back when they were alive, to try to understand themselves what all this meant, try to go back to the place and remember their fallen comrades, but to talk to the Japanese, to try to come to, because it's, how do you come to terms with it in your mind? And I think they were wrestling with it, almost all their life. So the Japanese, in a kind of spirit of reconciliation, would invite surviving Nagasaki prisoners back. But it's taken till this year. They've actually erected a memorial to the prisoners of 14B for the, 1945, 2023. It's taken quite a long time to get round to that.
Okay, you'll love this next one, John. You've had it far too easy so far. This one's going to put you on the spot.
Okay.
In researching this book, did you come to any conclusion as to whether the use of the atomic bombs in Japan was justified in the context of that stage of the Second World War?
Well, that of course is the big question, and it's not for me in the book to express views. I just reflect the views of those who survived, and I think what they feel is that they've seen the horrible consequences that they've seen on the ground, and I think that they felt that dropping a nuclear bomb was wrong, but at the same time, they thought we wouldn't have survived without it. So they felt quite troubled about it, and I think worried about it, went backwards and forwards in their mind, talked about it perhaps to their kids or family, because I think it was a real concern. So some of them were passionately anti-nuclear, and yet at the same time were realistic enough to know that if it hadn't been for that, they probably would have been killed, because that seemed to be the Japanese plan, was to terminate the lives of all prisoners if there was an invasion.
Any more questions in the room? Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for your talk. I just wondered, was there any evidence of any medical surveys or any form of medical curiosity on the survivors of the blast? So it just strikes me that the immediate aftermath of World War II was the Cold War, where there was great anticipation of another nuclear conflict, and lots of advice was given to people on how to survive that nuclear conflict that never happened. Where would that advice have better come from than surviving? Was there any attempt to join those dots?
I don't think there was. I think that when they were forgotten when they got home, it was a fairly small group of people. And when they got home, I think they were forgotten. Yes, of course, they had a story to tell, they had lessons to learn. Even if it was a simple thing like being in a shelter was better than being out in the street. So I think that they did have some survival learnings that they could have passed on, but they were never passed into, this was just buried, basically.
Any more? Final question? Yeah.
The largest, racially the largest number of prisoners of war were Indian soldiers. Were there any in Nagasaki? So I've looked for information about Indian soldiers, prisoners of war.
There were no Indian soldiers in Nagasaki. The largest group who worked on the railway were British, followed by the Dutch. In Nagasaki, there were more Dutch than there were British and Australian and Americans, although there were representatives of all those 4 nations there, but there were no Indians.
Just one final thing. Someone mentioned, I think you mentioned earlier about the Christian person. I think, am I right in thinking Nagasaki was the most Christian city in Japan?
It was the most European. It was the most Christian. It had a strong Catholic church there, a Catholic cathedral, and people were queuing up to go into it when the bomb dropped and were killed. So from that point of view, it seemed like a strange choice, but it was only the reserve. It was the secondary target. It was only an hour from Kokura, so of course they had to have a second plan if they couldn't drop the bomb on Kokura, and Nagasaki was the nearest one of the
Wonderful.
cities.
Well, thank you. I think unless anyone has a desperate last question, we'll say a very big thank you to John Willis for that fantastic talk. Thank you, John. And thank you also to everyone here and online for attending tonight. And as John mentioned, there are copies of his excellent book available. I have read it, or rather I listened to the audio book, and it's as you can imagine, with someone with John's journalistic and documentary background, it's very readable and highly recommended, and a pretty shocking story, to be honest. But anyway, thank you all very much.